You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome back to the CraftsmanOnLine podcast. This is a weekly half-hour program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of CraftsmanOnLine. I'm happy to welcome him back in as part of our Building Better Builders series, Brother John S. Nagy. Welcome back to the pod, Brother John.
It's good to be here, brother. It's nice to see a series that is ongoing where we can continue to unfold a conversation over a series of months on relevant topics to the craft.
Absolutely. We recognize Brother Nagy. He's a member of the Pearl of the West Masonic Lodge number 146, Newport Richey, Florida. He's also a member of the Florida Lodge of Research, 32nd degree Mason, and the 2014 recipient of the Dwayne E. Anderson Award for Excellence in Masonic Education. And we're lucky to partner up with him as the author of the Building Better Builders series of uncommon Masonic education books. We know him from the workshops, his blog, just endless thoughts, and we're going to continue to build on this series with our topic this week, which is the working tools of entered apprentice. And while I was getting into this episode, I found a medical research article, which I found was interesting, written last year by Brother Jonathan Koppel, and he's an entered apprentice and medical student at Baylor. And in his paper, he talks about the two known working tools of entered apprentice. We'll start there. The 24-inch gauge and the Common Gavel. And he shares these as the perspective on a medical profession, connecting the working tools with what he learned in medical school. Now, what I was interested was how he connected the 24-inch gauge, which something is very real in the medical field, which is physician burnout, and then the Common Gavel with what he calls the hidden curriculum of character growth, which I've never heard it described that way. So, Brother Nagy, when you're working with newly made Masons, what's the example or lesson that you use to make sense of these two known working tools that come through the degrees?
Oh, that's a great question. I usually take on a Socratic method. I ask a series of questions related to what they think they need to do with these tools. And I get from them like a benchmark, so to speak, of what their best thoughts, because obviously they think they're being tested and they're just basically being asked to think about it. And in thinking about it, they test themselves by sharing the knowledge that they have about the working tools with me. But in truth, I don't think a lot of entered apprentices go beyond what they've been told. So they'll regurgitate exactly what they remember hearing, or they'll say verbatim what it is that the proficiency tells them to say about the working tools, and they leave it like that, and they smile like a Cheshire cat, and they want to pat themselves on the back. And then when you start asking them about the 24-inch gauge, and you start talking about the sanity of those divisions, 3 equal parts, 8 hours apiece. How the heck are you going to do time management doing that? And my usual comment back to them is, brothers, you got to throw out that notion that it's quantity. And they look at me like I've got 3 eyes, and they say, well, you're using the number 8, how could that not be quantity? And that's about when I start introducing the apprentices the understanding that numbers don't always denote quantity. And sometimes they denote quality. And they look at me like they have no clue as to what it is that I'm talking about. And that's when I whip out the good old scriptures and I say, do you think the number 40 is actually 40? 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years in the desert. And they say, well, it says 40. And I said, do you know that Hebrew, there are no numbers? It's all written out. That numbers are written out as words, and you're not supposed to take them as quantities most of the time. They denote quality. And then I go back to the 40. Anytime that you see the number 40, what you're seeing is a quality of an experience that is having to do with a test. 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. Jesus was out there for 40 days and 40 nights. Not a number. It's a quality. He was being tested. Just like Moses. Moses was wandering in the desert for 40 years. Was it 40 years? No. The 40 denotes he was out in the desert being tested. And anytime you see the number 40, it denotes a test. It's a symbolic representation. Just like the number 7. 7 denotes completion. If you take a look at all the times that the number 7 appears in texture, in the text, you're being told that what's going on is until completion. And when you take that understanding, like 7 years to be an apprentice, it's not 7 years. It's you're serving an apprenticeship until it's completed. And the number 7 denotes that, just like the 7 liberal arts and sciences. They denote the basic background. And yes, there are 7 enumerated, but the 7 liberal arts and science is a complete liberal arts and science education. And there are things in between that you have to be using and studying that are not exactly spelled out. So by the time we get around to the 24-inch gauge being divided into 3 equal parts, I look at them and I say, do you think the 8 has to do with a number or a quality? And of course, they're going to say, oh, it's obviously quality because this is what you've been lecturing on me. And I said, the 8 denotes more of a balanced experience between those 3 divisions than having to do with numbers in any way, shape, or form. You have to make sure that you have a work balance with refreshment balance with a service balance. And so, if you have to work 10 hours a day, then basically you want to make sure that whatever time you have left is going to first and foremost be refreshing, and whatever time you have left in between that is towards service work. And so what you really want to do with the 24-inch gauge is understand that it denotes a work, refreshment, and service balance, and that it's really not about the numbers. It's making sure that no specific area dominates your life to the exclusion and detriment of the others, so the others are not taken care of.
Well, I love how you framed it in that, yeah, the newer brothers, we hand them these working tools. We say, we present you with these tools. We're basically giving them the definition of what it is. Once you said that, it really rang true for me because I'm like, I really didn't start thinking about how I was going to use these working tools until I got to the fellow craft and the master mason degrees, where now I'm a student. I've been through this first degree, these first 2 things that you're given. You are completely reliant on somebody else to tell you. We are talking not about the literal meaning of this, but the speculative meaning of these things.
It goes
deeper
far,
esoteric value.
Exactly. It goes deeper. We're using the terms, these are operative tools, but we use them speculatively. And what is not said in between the words, but it should be understood is, all right, so here's practical tools. And what we're going to do is use them practically in a symbolic way. And if we understand the symbolism of these tools, we can apply them in our lives in a way of balancing our lives or shaping our lives or whatever the tool is designed to do. We have to understand how this applies to our lives symbolically. And of course, the ultimate end is, and this is the irony, although we're taking operative tools and we're applying them speculatively to our lives, we still have to use them operatively in our lives in a speculative way. So when we talk about the 24-inch gauge, we are to understand all that this denotes has to do with, okay, so we have to make sure, first of all, that our lives are balanced in these 3 realms. That's number 1. And then we have to understand what setting priorities is, because when we are divvying up our time, we have to establish priorities as how we're going to use that time and the aspects of our lives that we can never go back to because of our vices and superfluities that we're supposed to be divesting. So we're not supposed to be wasting our time with things that are superfluous, especially those superfluous items that are harmful to ourselves, our business, and others. So we get into rolling up our sleeves and talking about, okay, so we've got an operative tool that we're supposed to be using speculative, but actually, even on our speculative use, we're supposed to be using them in an operative way for our own lives. And so we're bouncing back and forth like a ping pong, and we're trying to make sure that the candidates are not lost in all that transition back and forth. They've got to understand the symbolic application.
And these two working tools are presented together. And I kind of wish that we could change the order of operation so that you get the Common Gavel explained to you first and then the 24-inch gauge. Because I think what immediately starts to happen is when you start getting the lecture on the history or the use of the 24-inch gauge, everybody closes their mind and they imagine a clock. And they literally try to go, well, how am I going to spend 8 hours for this? As you said, they start to compartmentalize their day.
Yep.
And I, like you, have written, a thought piece about this, and that basically, it's the 24 hours of the day. You don't spend it all in one shot. It's like acquiring your step goal with your Apple Watch. You're going to use a little bit in the morning. You're going to do some throughout the day. And by the end of the day, that's, how you measure that you've invested your time. Why I say we could flip that is because I think if you close your eyes and said, here's the Common Gavel, you get this first. And it's the one tool that you immediately, I think all of us have the same image in our mind that comes when you think of the use of it, is breaking off those decisions that we have to, and you can see it like an arm swinging that hammer and going, yeah, that's what I need to do with my life, is break off this rust and shake off these things that are slowing me down. That makes sense. That's why I just wish that they would have flipped those two around.
Well, there's a lot of things within ritual that could very well be flipped around. But what would you have to talk about if you had it in the right order? It's
right. Who's to say that what I'm suggesting would be the right order? And I think at the end of the day, it's the explanation. And I feel that the 24-inch gauge, because so much more of it is explained, and that the Common Gavel is just to do that, to break off the corners, that it just kind of goes, oh yeah, that's what hammers do. They break things.
Yes.
I want to get your light on this. When I read that medical student and he talked about the building and the defining of one's character, I've never heard the Common Gavel explained really so eloquently.
By him?
By anyone. It's usually just kind of, it's left out there like that, that last little period in the ellipsis.
Let me address exactly what it is that you're wanting me to expand upon. That Common Gavel, you're told that you're supposed to use it to divest yourself, and I'm paraphrasing, vices of superfluities. You're supposed to divest yourself. But unless you've actually understood what a vice and a superfluity is, how do you know how to aim that gavel to start divesting? I mean, you seriously do not want to start whacking that Ashlar until you know what it is that you need to be taking off. And so how do you know? Well, interestingly enough, imagine, if you will, a flanked circumpunct, the point within a circle flanked by two perpendicular parallel lines. If you take those two rods that are flanking them and crisscross them, so now you have what is called a divided circumpunct. Imagine a quartered off. Okay, so you got them in 4 equal parts. And on one side, let's say the right side, you have vices and superfluities. And on the left side, you have virtues, the 7 virtues that are talked about during lecture. You've got the theological virtues, tied up with many jurisdictions. You've got the Jacob's ladder associated with that. And then you've got the cardinal virtues, which is associated most of the time with the perfect points of entrance. Well, you've got 7 in total, which is kind of convenient with the 7 deadly sins. You've got and again, we're back to 7. Are they complete? Well, we're trying to tell you through the number 7 that you have to look at virtues in a complete way, and you've got to look at the deadly sins in a complete way, because it's alluding to that indirectly. And those vices and superfluities are the 7 deadly sins. And if you take a look at every single one of those 7 deadly sins, they are basically virtues in extreme. They're unbalanced. Greed only becomes greed when it's success. You definitely need to have things coming into your life, but when you have more than you need, it becomes a greed. And so far and so forth. So when you're taking up that gavel, what you're doing is, although you're directing the gavel toward vices and superfluities, it's being guided by the virtues, the 7 virtues that are denoted in ritual, the cardinal and the theological virtues. So every time that you take that gavel and you direct it toward your ashlar, it is being directed by virtue. And there's no way on God's green earth that you're going to be able to divest any of those vices and superfluities unless you're directing that gavel with virtue. So by divesting, you're actually investing virtue. Now, interestingly enough, one of the working tools that you are introduced to when you are shown the 3 great lights is the square. What is the square? We're supposed to use it to square our actions, right? Well, the square alludes to the square of virtue. And there's no way on God's green earth that you're going to have the square of virtue unless you are using the common gavel directed by virtue to invest in virtue as you're divesting vices and superfluities. So you literally create the square of virtue by divesting your vices and superfluities, and you're squaring your ashlar as a result of investing the virtues, which bring about the squareness. So there you have a working tool that you're supposed to actually develop by doing the entered apprentice work, by swinging that common gavel directed by virtue. That brings about an internalization of the square of virtue, which you have to have in order to do fellow craft work. And if you remember the ritual where it talks about the jewels, and we're not going to argue about whether they're movable or immovable, because depending on where you're coming from, but we're talking about the jewels, the rough ashlar is transformed into the perfect ashlar, transformed by the use of the working tools to adjust the ashlar. And how are you adjusting the ashlar as an entered apprentice? Well, you're adjusting it using the common gavel directed by virtue, and that virtue develops a square of virtue. So bam, you've got the square of virtue adjusting the ashlar as a direct result of investment of virtue by use of the common gavel.
You hit so many points there. I just want to retouch on 2 of them really quick.
Go for it.
The first one is, if you ever come to my house, you'll see why, behind my photos, behind pictures that we hang up on the wall, there'll be several little holes, because I'm that guy that looks like the spot. That's center. No. And the whole time you're talking about this, and I'm like, wow, as an entered apprentice, they give us just enough tools to be dangerous when it comes to applying Masonic principles to our life. And that's why it's important that you have a good mentor to kind of help you line that up. Like you should have had a shop teacher. Yeah, super, super critical. So that's the first thing while you're talking about this, I'm like, how many times have you been told how to, as a man, be more productive during the day, or try this, or inbox 0, or any of these corporate or business, teachings that are out there? Okay. You have all of this, but then you don't know how to put it to work for yourself just yet. Well, if we just handed an entered apprentice this gavel and said, go start swinging things out of your life, how do they know? They don't know how. So you've lined it up beautifully. The second thing is that, for our podcast listeners and also the video viewers here, I'm going to give you a little hint. We're playing a game. It's kind of like a Masonic scavenger hunt. Now, we know of in the ritual that, yes, there are 2 entered apprentice working tools that are explained, but Brother Nagy also talked about another working tool that is observed. I can't do it on the podcast version. I'm hoping maybe at the at-home version on the video screen, you can put up like little 1, 2, 3. Keep a count, viewer and listener, of the working tools we're going to talk about, because this segment of our program is really going to blow your mind when you sit there and go, oh my gosh, there were all of these other things that were happening in the room that I wasn't really paying attention to, or that were explained to me as an entered apprentice that now as a master mason, we're starting to connect some of the dots. So we've already hit up 4 just in this short period of time here. So I'm going to recap.
Okay,
we talked about
name of the 4. Go ahead.
24-inch gauge.
Yep.
24-inch gauge, common gavel.
Yep.
We talked about the square, and you talked about the rough, and I guess you could say perfect Ashlar. So that would be 5. We're up to 5 here. So
I mentioned a working tool and it went right past you.
We talked about immovable. We talked about, you got me even on this one. And
the point within a circle flanked by 2 perpendicular parallel lines. It is a working tool, and it is one of the most diverse working tools. If you've ever seen my 6.5-hour workshop, I use that throughout the entire 6.5 hours, showing all sorts of neat diagrams using a circle with a point within it and 2 lines. And I have them parallel, then I have them crossed, then I have them, and then I slam them. I go through 6.5 hours using that one working tool. And I even touch upon the fact that that particular configuration, when you throw a Bible on top of it, is a working tool denoting obligation.
Very good. Is that all of them? Did we cover them all? I think there's a few that are still out there that we haven't.
Well, I mentioned the 3 great lights. And if you recall, the volume of Sacred Law is literally described as our rule and guide. That makes it a working tool.
I know that there was a mystery one that I was trying to come together with. I never really thought of, I always think of the point within a circle. It's personally my Masonic rabbit hole. It's the one thing that I've been sucked into, that I'm always open to hearing, having a conversation with, learning about. And I never really thought of it as a working tool for an entered apprentice. I just think it's one of the most beautiful parts of, our teachings that is out there, that when you hear about it, you're like, well, okay, that's kind of like the golden rule. That's how we should be thinking. It's the code, so to speak, the etiquette, all of those things kind of combined together. And this is why I think, getting back to something I had said earlier, it's why it's super significant when you said usually an entered apprentice doesn't ask you about the working tools. It's kind of our role to explain these deeper meanings to them.
It's up to us, because they won't do it on their own. They're too busy being told what to do. They're being told what to memorize. They're being told what to regurgitate back. And I have yet to see a dominant thrust by any jurisdiction to focus upon explaining the application of the tools that are quite visibly used throughout, or at least pointed and directed toward, through the entered apprentice ritual. Now, I said almost. I actually know of one area in Kentucky where they progress their apprentices and fellow crafts extremely slowly. They admit people into the lodge that are willing to do a very, very long form, drawn out internship, so to speak. And they're basically asked in the beginning, do you want to basically move yourself up to Master Mason like most jurisdictions do, or do you actually want to take your time, learn the degree, do the work that the degree actually points you toward? And I don't think there has been one candidate, or shall I say petitioner, who has taken the easy way out. They have all said, no, we'll take our time. Of course, they allow the entered apprentices to come into the lodge during lodge meetings at open meetings. They just don't vote. So they have got that option. So they are not, they're not missing out on anything other than going to the 2nd or 3rd degree ritual. And they take the time. They have a journal. They have workbooks that they do time management analysis. They set their priorities and they communicate and talk about what they are. They have a mentor that they can talk about their specific vices and superfluities in confidence, chest to chest, so they can start looking at what it takes to divest themselves of the ones that are causing the greatest challenges in their lives. They're literally birthing men in this particular lodge. And I got to tell you, I'm whelmed at how they've taken some of the books that I've written and taken it to the next level, and they're applying it within the lodge itself. It's wonderful to see. And I get weekly updates, which is really cool.
Well, it's also a great way of explaining the maturing process that goes through the role of the rough Ashlar to the perfect Ashlar. And I feel that so many times in ritual, you'll be told, okay, well, there's the rough Ashlar. And then as, Masons, we want to strive to become a perfect Ashlar. Boom. We never really talk about that long line of how from A to B. And I think you did a great job of explaining that building process.
Well, I can tell you this, it's unfortunate within our society, we don't have an addition to the rough and perfect Ashlar. We don't have anything known about the common Ashlar. And I often hear people say, oh, I'm always going to be a rough Ashlar. And I just cringe because they have no clue what they're saying. Not coming from an operative background, or at least not taking the time to study operative masonry, they don't understand that the moment that you take a tool to a rough Ashlar, it is no longer known as a rough Ashlar. It's now known as a common Ashlar. And as it's being moved from rough Ashlar to perfect Ashlar, that common Ashlar basically means it's being brought up to suitability for the builder's use. And when it's finally suitable, then it's ready for raising and it's ready for positioning and cementing. The problem is that most of the masons that I encounter, they believe that no one will ever be a perfect Ashlar, and they throw this terrible, terrible statement of nobody's perfect, indicating that nobody's flawless, which our degree work doesn't talk about being flawless. Everything that our degrees point toward is talking about being well-informed, being suitable for the builder's use. And that's what the word perfect means in our ritual. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are putting their own understanding and their own spin on it. So where I'm going with this is when you complete the entered apprentice work, you should be the perfect Ashlar. You should have your corners squared. You should have virtue. You'd have your vices and superfluities divested. You have your time management down pat. You've got your priorities set. You have internalized the plumb, the square, and the level by consequence of doing the work that is pointed toward by the first degree. You have circumscribed and subdued your passions and kept your desires within due bounds using that compass that is clearly pointed out when the three great lights are described. What is this? It's a compass. What are we supposed to do with it? Circumscribe and subdue. It's a working tool, And again, so much of the subtleties are missed and never gone over by the members of the craft because they're never talked about at the entered apprentice level. And ironically, when you get to the fellow craft level, you are ready to be raised. And therefore, you're shown a staircase. And what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to haul your butt up the staircase, haul your Ashlar up the staircase. And by literally climbing the staircase, you're hauling your Ashlar up to the top of the stairs. Where do we find? We find something called astronomy, right? And by that point, we have studied what was needed to be studied in order to be basically celebrated as a fellow craft, a full-fledged masterful mason. And the Master Mason degree is merely a ceremony that confirms that you've done the work of raising yourself by climbing up that staircase. But you don't climb the staircase unless you have perfected your Ashlar. Even an operative mason knows that you don't raise a stone that has not been perfected, suitable for the builder's use. You never want to do work on site. You want to make sure it's ready to go so it be positioned and cemented into place. So, we go on and on and on. And
the more that you're explaining things, I was just watching the news tonight after dinner before we had the taping for our podcast. And here in the DC area, they are reopening the Washington Monument finally. And it'll be open this summer and people will be able to go back up the top of it. And they were explaining, 555 and some odd, feet tall. And the thing that was neat was the reporter said, and it's the oldest and tallest Masonic building. And I paused for a second. I'm like, really? Oh yeah. And then because it's made of stone. And it got to that whole point of we were talking about the perfect Ashlar, the Common Gavel, and using our minds as stones and coming together as masons. And that it's important that when you talk about the role of the entered apprentice, that really it's open to the rest of us lodge members to help this new brother find his way into the craft, to understand that this is what we're all trying to do, because we're all trying to lift our minds up like that Washington Monument to that greater goal in life.
Amen. Amen.
With that said, I think this is a good place to wrap up our episode for this week on the Building Better Builders. And we've talked about, I'm sure we've opened a lot of eyes with this episode on, wait, there's more than one working tool for an
Wait, there's more.
So to just kind of recap with things, we talked about, the first two and then the others that an entered apprentice is exposed to. And then when you really start applying your own mind and knowledge of the craft, you're like, yep, this all makes sense. For you, Brother Nagy, what do you believe the first working tool an entered apprentice must kind of set in order to make all of these others work and do the work that's possible? And why would you pick that tool?
It would be the plumb. And although it is emphasized as a fellow craft working tool, if an entered apprentice comes in and they put their hand on that volume of sacred law, that book ought to be emblematic of what is etched in their hearts. It should be a blatant example of what they hold sacrosanct within their heart, etched into the very structure of their being. And if they put their hand on that volume of sacred law, they're obligating themselves to, first and foremost, not share any secrets. Don't ruin it for anybody else. Support their brothers. But above all, they are obligating themselves to be better than they are now. There's only one tool that they could use that is the exemplified within the actual Holy Writ itself, and that is the plumb. And by setting their plumb on that Holy Writ, they are setting a standard that they are to measure themselves by and all other people that they encounter. And yes, it's not just ourselves that we will be judging by that plumb. We'll be judging others. Why? Because if you remember later on in our obligation, we are to judge our brothers with candor. And we are supposed to reprimand them in loving and brotherly ways. And we are charged to do this. Well, you can't do that unless you've got a standard that is unshakable. And as it said said in the Holy Scripture, Amos, I'm going to set a plumb in the middle of my people. And as much as I love the words that are said in Scripture, it essentially says, not only am I going to set this in the midst of my people, but I'm not going to let anything pass by me anymore. Everybody's going to be judged by that plumb, and I'm not going to overlook anything any further from this point on. And it's any small wonder that that beautiful, beautiful statement is stated to us to remind us that we are to do the same thing. We are not to overlook anything any further. We are setting a standard, and that's setting the plumb. And we internalize that, and we carry with us through our entered apprentice work, through our fellow craft work, through our master mason work and beyond. We internalize that standard and we act accordingly. So if you're asking me, what is the very first thing that an entered apprentice sets? It's his plumb by taking his obligation on that holy writ that ought to be an exact copy of what it is that's etched in his heart already.
I just can't get over how many newly made masons, especially in New York State, as we get ready to close, the lodges for the summertime, who are hearing this podcast and getting so much out of it, but also us master masons who've been in the craft for a while that might be a little rusty with some of these tools. Just what a wonderful workshop this was for the mind for the summertime. So thank you very much, Brother Nagy.
You're most welcome. And I'm going to do a shameless plug. If you enjoyed this podcast, I do a full 40 to 45 minutes going through the working tools that an entered apprentice would work with and develop if they actually did the work that the entered apprentice degree points them to. There are easily 10 of them, and I go through them. I show the order to which they're introduced, how they are developed by using the 24-inch gauge and the Common Gavel and the other working tools that are shown to the entered apprentice as they go through the degree. And they're all over the place. And they are described, which is really cool too, because it's not like we're left in the dark saying, oh, here's a working tool. Guess what it's used for? And no, the ritual actually tells us what we're supposed to be using it for. If you have an astute mind and you go through the ritual, you're going to have some aha moments. If you're looking for working tools, they're actually there described. So if there's an interest, I'd be honored to come to your lodge or even come to your lodge through Zoom or in person and do this presentation for the benefit of the brothers.
You can get started by finding him on Facebook at John S. Nagy or on his website, which is coach.net. So that's the word coach.net, and that will get you started with his Building Better Builders series, coaching supports, videos, presentations, and even those direct questions that you might want to ask him offline. He can take those for you as well. Brother Nagy, again, thanks so much for coming on this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast.
Brother Michael, it's been an honor and a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our next connection next month. And do you know what that topic's going to be?
Our next Building Better Builders episode is going to be on the history of the craft unmasked.
Wonderful. That goes into that book, The Craft Unmasked, that was a follow-up to Building Free Men. And oh, by the way, the follow-up to that book was The Craft Perfected, and I have a new book actually coming out pretty soon, within the next 2 months, God willing, The Craft Mastered, Completing the Temple, a Fellow Craft Dream.
Just a reminder, new episodes of the Craftsman Online podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.